Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We've had fantastic registration for this series, and we're happy to see so many people logging on. Looks like we've got almost 125 people in our room so far. So I'm sure we'll have a few more people joining us as we go through the introductions. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Haley Ross, and I work for the Columbia Mountains Institute, or CMI for short, and we're one of the host organizations for this webinar that you're joining today. And I'm joined here by Juliette Craig and Kendall Benesh from the Kootenai Conservation Program, or KCP for short. And our exciting news is that both CMI and KCP run these great webinar series. And this year we decided to pair up. So what you're joining is the 7th season of CMI's CRED Talks, or the Columbia Region Ecological Discussions, and KCP's Winter Webinar Series, together, all as one. And I'm very excited about that. My next slide here. So what can we expect? This season of webinars will explode. This is the nervousness coming through. I'll start over again. This season of webinars will explore the theme of foundations of resilience, understanding departures from historical ecosystems and adapting for resilient futures. We'll be welcoming 7 speakers who will draw on patterns from the past, challenges in the present, and scenarios for the future to explore adapting ecosystems for resilience in the Columbia Basin. Today, we're going to hear from Dr. Gregory Greene, who I'll introduce in more detail in just a moment. This year's CRED Talks and Winter Webinar Series is financially supported by the Columbia Basin Trust. Many thanks to the Trust for helping us to get this series up and off the ground. And before I go any further, I would like to acknowledge the land that I broadcast from today in Revelstoke, BC, which is the unceded homeland of the Sinixt people. The Shuswap people have also stewarded this land for millennia, and the Ktunaxa call this valley the land of the chickadee in their creation story. The Okanagan Nation Alliance also expressed very strong connections to this place. And what I would like to do now is invite you to share your own acknowledgement, if you feel comfortable, via the chat. So you could open up your chat feature, which you'll find at the bottom hand of your screen if you hover your mouse there, and you could share which territory it is that you're zooming in from today, along with your name and your affiliation. This is a great way of testing to ensure that you see that chat function, because you may be using it later on in the webinar. As soon as I see things popping up on my screen here, I'll move on. Great. Okay. Hi, Joe. Okay, so as those acknowledgements flow in, what I would like to do is just take the opportunity to tell you a little bit about CMI, one of your host organizations for this webinar. CMI is a nonprofit society, and we're an association of people working in the various fields of ecology. Our home range is southern British Columbia, Canada, but our membership extends across BC into Alberta, the Yukon, and the Northwest Territories. One of the main things that we do is provide professional development opportunities in the form of conferences, courses, and webinars that address everything from skill-based research techniques to land management conundrums. Our website, of course, is one of the best places to learn more about what we do. And on that website, you'll find great resources such as proceedings documents from all of our major events. You can find those at www.cmiae.org. At this stage, what I'd like to do is just pass it on over to KCP with Juliette Craig from, oh, I already said. And like I said, I'm just really thrilled to be working with these folks. So over to you, Juliette.
Thanks, Haley. My name is Juliette Craig, and Kendall Benesh and I are joining from the Kootenai Conservation Program, or KCP. And KCP's work occurs in the unceded traditional territories of the Ktunaxa, Shuswap, Sinixt, and Syilx Okanagan peoples who have stewarded this land for many generations. We are a broad partnership of 85 land and water conservation and stewardship groups, Indigenous nations, government agencies, resource industries, and agricultural producers working throughout the East and West Kootenays. And our mandate is to coordinate and facilitate conservation efforts on private land and to generate the support and resources needed to maintain this effort, including building technical knowledge in webinars like this. And we're very excited to be hosting this webinar series with CMI, and would like to give an additional thanks to our program sponsors, without whom we would not be able to support this type of work. Just wait for that slide to progress.
Thanks, Juliet.
Now, just a couple of housekeeping details. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the event webpage within a week. And we ask that you remain muted and feel free to turn off your camera during the presentation. Please note that we'll be using the chat function for our Q&A, and you're welcome to add your questions to the chat at any time, but we won't be addressing questions until the end of the talk. Over to you, Haley.
Great, thanks very much. I think maybe we've fast forwarded to Greg's screen there for a moment, but we're back, so we'll get there in just a moment. I know this is why we're all here. I'd like to introduce the person that you're here to listen to today. So Dr. Gregory Greene, who is going to present How the Past Haunts the Future, Colonization and the Loss of Dry Forest Resilience in the Southern Rocky Mountain Trench of British Columbia. I have a brief little bio I'd like to read. Greg is a dendrologist, fire ecologist, and GIS developer. He uses tree rings, computer programming, and fire behavior modeling to understand the interactions of forests and fires. His doctoral research reconstructed historical forest structures and fires to understand how forest and fire regimes have changed through time. His postdoctoral research assesses the efficacy of fuel treatment in community forests throughout British Columbia. Greg also works with Indigenous communities to help develop cultural burn monitoring programs. We're very fortunate to have Greg here with us today. Thanks very much. I'll pass it to you.
All right, thanks so much, Haley. I really appreciate that introduction. To begin, I'd like to recognize that I'm presenting to you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Syilx First Nation, and that I benefit from the colonization, privilege, and the displacement of the original peoples of this territory. I'd like to thank CMI and KCP for organizing this event, and I'm really excited to be leading off this year's Cred Talk series. Today, I'll be presenting findings from my PhD research to show how colonization has degraded the resilience of dry forests in southeastern BC, how the effects of colonization will continue to be felt for decades to come, and what we can do to mitigate the negative effects. So what is colonization? The Oxford Dictionary provides us with these three definitions: the action or process of settling among and establishing control over the indigenous people of an area. The action of appropriating a place or domain for one's own use, and the action by a plant or animal of establishing itself in an area. Given these definitions, I'd like to provide you with three key examples of colonization that have and continue to affect the resilience of dry forests in the Southern Rocky Mountain Trench. And although I'm focusing on the Southern Rocky Mountain Trench here, I'm sure you'll see parallels throughout the province. First is fire exclusion, which began with the loss of Indigenous cultural practices, including cultural fires, when the Ktunaxa were forced onto reserves and into residential schools in the 1800s. Second is the historical high-grade logging that occurred in the late 18 and early 1900s. Logging in the Southern Rocky Mountain Trench was so extensive they cut themselves out of readily accessible areas by the 1930s. In fact, logging in the trench is the primary reason why the province created the annual allowable cut in the 1940s. And these logging effects haunt the Rocky Mountain Forest District to this day. Third is the landscape scale loss of fire through suppression. And note that I consider suppression to be a component of fire exclusion in this presentation. Although organized fire suppression in BC began in the early 1900s, its effectiveness has increased through the years. The BC Wildfire Service currently contains 94% of all surface fires by 10 a.m. the day after discovery, which stands as a decades-long success rate. So what about the 6% of fires that aren't suppressed? Some of these are left to burn as modified response fires. However, many occur during extreme weather that overcomes suppression efforts. And it's the fires that escape suppression to become large, catastrophic, high severity fires that everyone in the province has become so intimately familiar with in recent years, through weeks and months of smoke. These fires are also potentially a great concern for dry forest resilience. And the reason I say potentially is because there are conflicting perspectives of historical fire regimes in dry forests. Understanding that fire regime science can involve quite a bit of academic nuance, I'm going to try to keep this explanation as simple as possible for you. The first perspective argues that historically, fires were quite frequent, and the frequent recurrence of fires reduced the abundance of surface and ladder fuels. And less surface and ladder fuels meant that fires stayed on the ground, killed few large trees, and maintained low density forests through time. However, fire exclusion extended the time between fires, which allowed surface and ladder fuels to accumulate and increased the density of forests. From this perspective, increases in forest density and fuels promote higher severity fires during extreme weather events. High severity fires lead to the loss of forests, the loss of critical habitat, and open up the potential for conversion to non-forest ecosystems. And unfortunately, these changes are happening faster with climate change. The second perspective argues that historical fires were a mix of frequent and infrequent fires, which produced a heterogeneous mix of low and high density forests. Since the time between fires could be quite long, dense forests with abundant surface and ladder fuels were quite common. And since dense forests were common, high severity fires were a strong component of the fire regime. And for this reason, the concerns of perspective one are overstated. So given these differences, which perspective do we follow? Unfortunately, we lack sufficient information to make this assessment, especially concerning historical forest structures in composition, which have not been adequately reconstructed in British Columbia. What is clear, though, is that dense forests are at the heart of this debate. So these are what I focused my research on. To identify the origin and implications of dense stands in dry forests, I reconstructed fire history and historical and contemporary forest structures and compositions to identify changes in fire regimes and forests through time. By doing so, I identified the drivers of change and the implications of dense forests for tree health and forest resilience. My research was done in the southern Rocky Mountain Trench of BC. The study area is within the traditional and unceded territory of the Ktunaxa First Nation. The grasslands and forests here have co-evolved with and in response to cultural practices that have been implemented for more than 11,000 years. The forests are composed of varying combinations of ponderosa pine, western larch, and Douglas fir. And note that I've ranked these species by their tolerance to drought, fire, and shade as compared amongst the three species. Try to keep these in mind because these differences will provide context for many of my findings. My evidence came primarily from tree ring samples that were collected from over 2,000 trees. On the right, you can see the locations of my 20 research plots, which were randomly placed in dense, dry forests throughout the valley bottom of the trench. Candidate forests had to contain over 400 trees per hectare with no recent harvesting or tree planting. Each plot was fixed at an area of 1 hectare and were either circular or rectangular to accommodate different stand shapes. Within these plots, I documented the general stand structure, including live and dead trees, using 3 inventory plots that were placed at plot center and the northern and southernmost boundaries of the plot. Trees greater than 7.5 centimeters diameter were sampled with variable radius plots, and smaller trees in regeneration were sampled in fixed area plots. To reconstruct fire history, I documented all fire-scarred trees in the 1 hectare plots, including snags, logs, and stumps, and extracted 10 to 17 samples per plot. To reconstruct harvest history, I identified all stumps in 1/2 hectare plots and sampled between 2 and 12 stumps per plot. More stump samples were taken when multiple decay classes were identified amongst the stumps with a hope of capturing multiple potential harvest dates in each plot. To reconstruct canopy structure, I extracted samples from all live and dead canopy dominant trees in the 1 hectare plots. Subplots were placed around the largest live canopy dominant tree of each species to sample subdominant trees. A total of 32 subplots were established and were either 7.98 or 11.28 meters in radius, depending on the tree density. All trees and subplots were documented and samples were taken from up to 10 of the nearest live and dead trees per diameter class. In each 1 hectare plot, I also documented live and dead trees that appeared to be legacies of historical stands, but were otherwise not sampled. These included large diameter trees outside of subplots that were non-dominant, had broken tops, or were logs. So now on to results, and I'll start with the fire regime reconstructions. In this fire history chart, each horizontal line is a different plot, and each vertical tick is a recorded fire. The boxes with ticks at the bottom are composited fire records for all plots in the study area. All scars includes every tree with a scar, and the 2 boxes below only include years when at least 2 trees in the study area had scars, or at least 2 trees in each plot had scars. 623 fire events were recorded over an 850-year period. Tree ring approaches identified only 2 high severity fires, which generated the 2 youngest stands. During the periods when each plot had at least 3 scarred trees, mean fire return intervals averaged 11.6 years for all scarred trees and 14 and 18 years when at least 2 trees were scarred in the study area and in each plot. And in case you're wondering, I provided multiple versions of fire return intervals here because intervals are reported multiple ways in the literature, so this allows for direct comparison of my results to those of other studies. But regardless of the interval approach used, all are within the ranges described for frequent lower severity fire regimes using contemporary classifications. This evidence, combined with the rare occurrence of high severity fires, the long-lived trees and long fire records, and the influences of Ktunaxa fire stewardship conveyed through oral histories and ethnographies, and exemplified by a ponderosa pine tree with 52 scars, corroborate my conclusion that the historical fire regime was frequent and lower severity. So has the fire regime changed? Well, fires haven't occurred here for the last 48 to 140 years, creating a deficit of 8.6 fires across forests. Moreover, current fire-free periods exceed the longest historical fire return intervals in all plots, implying that these forests are now under a new fire regime. So the simple answer is yes. And these changes are the direct consequence of fire exclusion, which began with the forced relocation of the Ktunaxa onto reserves and the loss of cultural practices in the 1800s, and culminated with highly effective fire suppression throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Get a drink of water here. So now I'll move on to forest structure and composition. And I'll begin with this visual. These images represent the average configurations of historical and contemporary forests. Did they change? I think the answer here is pretty obvious. Historical forests were low density and open canopied, containing between 70 to 360 trees per hectare and 6 to 31 meters squared of basal area. Nearly half of these trees were large diameter ponderosa pine and western larch, which collectively occupied 61% of stand basal area throughout the study area. As I mentioned earlier, unchecked logging between 1890 to 1930 was devastating to these forests. This logging removed over 66% of all trees, including 91% of trees over 30 centimeters in diameter and 88% of stand basal areas. The preference for western larch and ponderosa pine altered the future trajectories of these forests towards dominance by Douglas fir. Contemporary forests now contain 800 to 14,000 trees per hectare and 18 to 41 meters squared of basal area. These changes represent a 1,400% increase in density and 140% increase in basal area. And Douglas fir now dominates stand densities and basal area. And these changes were driven by the combined effects of fire, fire exclusion, high-grade logging, and climate. And that leads me to this next component where I'll show how fires, fire exclusion, logging, and climate interacted to create these dense forests. I'm going to begin with the immediate effect of harvesting on stand age structures. In this image, we're seeing the disturbance history and establishment of trees through time for plot PPX02. Fire years are red triangles and harvest years are blue X's. Black and gray triangles indicate the years that canopy and subcanopy cohorts established. In case the term cohort is new to you, it basically means a pulse of trees that established in a short period of time. And in my case, it was when at least 20% of trees established within a 15-year period. In the background of the image, you'll see the cumulative establishment of canopy trees shown in black, and for subcanopy trees shown in gray. Overlaid on top of this in yellow and blue are reconstructed years when samples from dead legacy trees had tree rings present. Blue represents harvested trees, while yellow represents other dead trees. And I'd like to point out here that had I not reconstructed fire histories and included legacy trees in stand age reconstructions, I would have assumed that these stands were products of past high and mixed severity fires. But the overall point of this figure is that historical harvesting shaped the age structures of contemporary forests by removing the oldest trees. And this harvesting was clearly high grading. So here we see the most recent 200 years of reconstructed age structures and disturbances for the same plot. The contemporary forest is obviously dense because of the thousands of trees that established in the most recent cohorts. To understand how these cohorts were created, I separated cohort establishment into 3 categories. First, I examined the factors that set the stage for each of these cohorts to establish. All recent cohorts were initiated by moderate severity fires. However, harvesting predated initiating fires in 2 plots, so not all initiating fires were independent of human disturbances. Second, I examined the period immediately after cohorts initiated up until the final tree established in each plot to identify the factors that facilitated additional tree recruitment in each cohort. During these facilitation periods, harvesting, fires, and a short period of wetter climate interacted to enhance conditions for tree establishment. I found that more canopy trees established in stands with harvesting than stands with only fires. But the interactions of multiple disturbance types, particularly post-harvest fires, promoted the highest proportion of canopy tree recruitment. So I just mentioned climate, but haven't discussed it yet. So here I'll show you how climate interacted with harvesting and fires to amplify tree establishment. In panel A, we see the fire history chart I showed you earlier. What's new here is the black triangles, which represent initiation dates of the most recent cohorts. In panel B, we see the percentage of tree establishment across the study area since the 1100s. And in panel C, we see a tree ring reconstruction of the Palmer Drought Severity Index. The vertical blue line highlights a 15-year period of wetter climate that happened to coincide with the facilitation periods of 40% of plots. During this 15-year period, climate interacted with harvesting and fires to promote the establishment of 44% of trees in the study area. And finally, I examined the period after the last tree established in each plot. During this period, cohorts persisted through time because of fire exclusion, which removed fires that would have killed some trees, but also created opportunities for new trees to establish. As a result, the stand we see here is now in the stem exclusion stage of development, indicating that all available growing space is occupied and no trees are establishing in the understory. And these same trends occurred in all sampled forests, as I'll show you now. What we see here is a log-log relationship of density versus quadratic mean diameter through time for each stand in the study area. Quadratic mean diameter is simply a central tendency of tree diameter in a stand. And each line here represents a different stand. The bottom of each line represents stand conditions in the year that the last tree established. The top of the line represents conditions in 2013. All the points in between represent the annual changes through time. So what you're seeing is that each stand moves straight up at first, then most change direction toward the left. When stands are in the stem exclusion stage of development, you'll notice that for each year of growth, quadratic mean diameter increases while density remains constant. And this is the straight segment of each line, which indicates that no new trees are recruiting, but established trees are still able to grow. However, once all available resources have been tapped, self-thinning occurs as dominant trees outcompete less dominant trees for resources. This is apparent in the graph when the lines begin to tilt to the left, indicating density is decreasing, but the remaining trees are getting larger. And you'll notice that the slope of each line matches the standard rate of self-thinning, which is defined as minus 1.5. So not only are these stands in the stem exclusion stage of development, but 85% of them have actually reached the maximum carrying capacity of each site. So what are the implications of dense forests for tree health? In this figure, 3 indicators of stress are arranged vertically and separated by trees in different canopy positions. The top row shows the average standardized growth of trees over time. The broken black lines through the growth curves are linear representations of these growth trends, and each break represents significant changes in slopes. The gray horizontal lines are the long-term average growth rates standardized to a value of 1. So here's what we're observing. The growth rates of trees in all canopy height classes have declined. The annual occurrence of missing annual growth rings has increased, and the annual rates of mortality have increased. The suppressed and intermediate classes are clearly the most stressed, which agrees with our understanding of tree competition and density-dependent mortality, where larger trees outcompete smaller trees for light and resources, and smaller trees die as a result. However, the stress in canopy dominant trees is greater than that of codominants, which is counterintuitive. Canopy dominant growth decreased below the long-term averages sooner and dropped lower than that of codominants. Many more canopy dominant trees were missing rings through time, and there's more consistent mortality among canopy dominants. When looking at stress among canopy dominant species, all species were stressed, but the magnitude differed. Douglas fir was the least stressed, ponderosa pine was more stressed, and western larch was the most stressed. Another observation was also clear. Missing rings only occurred after growth declined, and mortality only occurred after growth dropped below long-term averages. This suggests that canopy dominant stress occurs in a sequence, starting with declining growth, followed by missing rings, and ending in tree death. Because of this relationship, missing rings and tree death are tied to growth rates. So what caused the growth declines and increases? Trends in climate collectively suggest higher temperatures and declining moisture availability throughout the study area. And although the change in minimum temperature occurred just before growth increased in all species, increasing growth is at odds with these climate trends. So rather than being driven by climate, these growth trends were driven by suppressed trees. To determine this, I compared the breakpoints in the growth of each species with the average percent of basal area occupied by live trees in each height class through time. In the top panel here, we see the growth of Douglas fir. In the bottom panel, the lines show the average percent of basal area occupied by trees in each height class. The black triangle indicates the year when basal area of suppressed trees reached a maximum, then declined. Also in the bottom panel is the accumulation of dead basal area by height class. Decreasing growth years are highlighted in red, increasing growth years are in blue, and the vertical dashed lines are years when growth switched above or below long-term growth averages. And here we see the same relationships, but for all species. Please focus your attention on the growth relationships with the basal area of suppressed trees, shown here in light gray. And I'll address the question about increasing growth first. It's apparent that the growth of each species increased 2 years after suppressed basal area declined. As seen here in light gray, suppressed basal area declined because many suppressed trees were dying. So increased growth appears to be tied to the declining basal area and death of suppressed trees. And this is where minimum temperature is important. Suppressed tree mortality is likely driven by increasing minimum temperature, which affected the entire study area simultaneously and synchronized the declines in the basal area of suppressed trees. It's possible that higher minimum temperatures, which imply warmer winters, are causing greater soil moisture deficits during summer droughts, which is driving higher rates of mortality among suppressed trees and indirectly alleviating stress in canopy-dominant trees. So now to address the drivers of decreasing growth. Here we see the percentages of basal area occupied by suppressed trees for key breakpoints in the growth of each species. 28% was a common basal area threshold among all species. From these relationships, the growth of canopy-dominant trees appears to slow down and ultimately drop below long-term averages once suppressed trees occupy greater than 28% of stand basal area. Growth then recovers above long-term averages when the basal area of suppressed trees drops below 28%. In stands with western larch that you see on the right there, the basal area of suppressed trees still exceeds 28% and may explain why western larch growth remains below the long-term average. So how are suppressed trees driving stress in canopy dominance? Their short heights prevent the suppressed trees from competing with canopy dominance for sunlight, especially in these dense stands. But suppressed trees collectively can compete with canopy dominant trees for soil water, and here's how. Tree rooting depth and size increase with the size of the tree. This means canopy dominance can access deeper soil water, whereas suppressed trees depend on limited amounts of water that penetrate the surface. But in times of drought, trees can move water through their roots from deeper soils to shallower soils to prevent the death of fine roots as soils dry. This hydraulic redistribution is stronger in larger and older trees, particularly among Douglas fir. And through this mechanism, it's possible that canopy dominants are supplying suppressed trees with water during times of drought. And because the canopy dominants require more water than suppressed trees, they're doing this at their own expense. While codominant and intermediate trees have better access to soil water than suppressed trees, it's not as good as that of canopy dominance, so they also benefit from the hydraulic redistribution of canopy dominance. Root grafting is another mechanism where small trees can benefit from larger trees. Through the presence of living stumps, I observed an average of 10% of Douglas fir trees in stands were root grafted. These grafts allow canopy dominance to directly share water, carbon, and nutrients with suppressed trees. Mycorrhizal fungi networks can also facilitate the sharing of resources. Below ground, Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, and western larch all form symbiotic relationships with mycorrhizal fungi that transport water, carbon, and nutrients among trees. And as Suzanne Simard has pointed out, larger mother trees respond to stress in smaller trees by sharing resources through these networks. So it's possible that the sharing of water through root grafts or mycorrhizal networks is negatively affecting canopy dominance in these dense stands. Additional below ground research is needed to investigate these three mechanisms further, but regardless of which are at play, there are limits to the ability of trees to share water in environments where water is already a limiting factor. And when there are more trees in stands than there are available resources, all trees will be stressed, as we have observed here. So what are the overall implications of these dense forests for dry forest resilience? Let's start with the direct effects of historical logging. In this figure, I've divided forests into three groups according to species composition, but I'll be discussing averages that were taken across all stands. As shown earlier, western larch and ponderosa pine historically comprised an average of 46% of densities and 61% of basal areas. By the 1930s, logging removed 2/3 of stand densities throughout the study area, but clearly favored the largest western larch and ponderosa pine trees, as 94% and 89% of their basal areas were removed. Western larch and ponderosa pine now only account for 19% of densities and 24% of basal areas. So it's clear that logging had an immediate and profound effect on species abundance by removing fire-tolerant western larch and ponderosa pine and elevating Douglas fir to a position of dominance across the study area. Next, let's see how each species is coping in these dense stands. This is the average density of snags per hectare for 3 snapshots in time. As we can see, more trees die as stand density increases through time. This is a clear reflection of the density-dependent mortality trend that I mentioned earlier, which is known to affect smaller trees and dense stands. Here we see the average percent of each species that is currently dead. Percentages are given for trees across 4 diameter classes, with the largest on the top and the smallest on the bottom. It's clear that the smallest trees are dying in large proportions, confirming the effects of density-dependent mortality. But notice the differences among the species. Western larch is clearly struggling here. Nearly all the saplings are dead, over 1/3 of the poles are dead, and a substantial portion of the dominants are dead. Ponderosa pine is faring better, but over half of those saplings are dead as well. So these stands are clearly favoring the long-term persistence of Douglas fir. Now let's look at regeneration trends. Here we see the average densities of regeneration per hectare for historical stands on the left and contemporary stands on the right. Prior to 1951, western larch and ponderosa pine accounted for 30% of all regeneration, but now account for less than 0.3%. I observed no western larch regeneration in these dense stands. If these trends continue, western larch and ponderosa pine are likely to be extirpated from these forests in the future. So now let's consider future climate as predicted by Climate BC. On the left, we see the configuration of BEC zones in 2013, which is the year I started this project. On the right, we see how the BEC zones are projected to change in response to climate in the 2050s. What we're observing is an expansion of the hottest and driest conditions in the valley bottom in dark gray, and an increase in warmer and wetter conditions in the foothills and lower slopes of the mountains in orange. So what does all of this mean? If conditions persist, we're likely to see a landscape scale reduction in western larch and ponderosa pine abundance, and as mentioned earlier, potential extirpation of these species from some of the forests. Unfortunately, the loss of western larch and ponderosa pine is having and will continue to have numerous detrimental effects on the resilience of these forests. And here I'll just focus on 3 of those effects. First, western larch and ponderosa pine are the most fire-tolerant conifers in BC. Replacing them with Douglas fir decreases stand-wide fire resistance and increases susceptibility to high severity fires, particularly in the future climates that we saw. Second, given the lack of regeneration, the density-driven stress amongst the trees, and the scale at which forests in these conditions exist, if these forests are destroyed by high severity fires, they're unlikely to recover back to a forest. In the Western US, large-scale shifts from forests to shrubs or grasslands are now common following large high severity fires. The hotter and drier climates in the future will only compound this situation. Third is a reduction in carbon stocks. As Suzanne Smard and her research team has shown, forest carbon stocks increase with species richness. This is because each species fulfills a niche. The greater the number of species, the greater number of niches are filled, which allows for more resources to be captured and stored. So now I'd like to synthesize the effects of colonization on dry forest resilience from the results that I presented to you. Prior to colonization, all contemporary dense stands were once low density and open canopied. In these stands, densities and compositions varied through time in relatively stable cycles. New trees regenerated during fire-free periods, but frequent surface fires killed most of this regeneration and even a few overstory trees. Surviving regeneration were subsequently recruited into overstories and replaced the few overstory trees that died from low and moderate severity fires. This cycle, which was shaped by an indigenous influenced fire regime, maintained metastability in forest structures through time and persisted for at least 800 years. Fire exclusion began shortly after colonization, with a reduction in indigenous fires as the Ktunaxa were forced onto reserves and fires began to be suppressed. In the absence of fire, regenerating trees that initiated from previous fires became larger and more fire resistant and began to form dense understory cohorts. Several facilitating and interacting factors, including selective harvesting, a brief but potent 15-year period of wetter climate, and post-harvest slash-driven fires, acted to release even more growing space, allowed even more trees to establish, and enhanced conditions for dense understory cohorts to recruit into overstories. Historical selective harvesting strongly shaped future stands by reducing the presence of western larch and ponderosa pine and increasing the dominance of Douglas fir. Fire suppression became much more effective throughout the 1900s, which allowed the subcanopy cohorts to persist through time. Contemporary stands now contain up to 14,000 live trees per hectare. The dense subcanopy cohorts, which resulted from past fire exclusion and forest harvesting, have increased stand-wide stress and altered the resilience trajectories of dry forests, as evidenced by reduced regeneration, including the absence of western larch regeneration, and high rates of stress and mortality among the largest trees. So what can forest managers do to help mitigate these effects. Heavy thinning treatments are needed to promote the growth of large fire-tolerant trees and enhance stand-wide resistance to fire. Based on my results, restoration treatments should prioritize stands containing Western larch, since this species is under the greatest stress. Given the absence of Western larch regeneration, treatment should aim to enhance conditions for new Western larch to establish. Treatment should also prioritize stands with greater than 28% of basal area comprised of suppressed trees. Large trees are under tremendous stress and are more likely to die if these stands are left untreated. The historical stand reconstructions from this study can be used as a guide to determine which structural and compositional attributes of contemporary stands can be retained and which need to be altered. In general, thinning should focus on removing the dense subcanopy trees that are driving stand-wide stress and retaining the large fire-tolerant trees to enhance the fire resistance of contemporary stands. Once dense forests are thinned, prescribed fires are needed to reintroduce fire as a key disturbance process and maintain metastability in forest structures through time. The range of variability in the frequency and severity of the historical fire regime that I reconstructed can guide prescribed fire treatments. Given that these ecosystems evolved in response to indigenous cultural influences, treatments must be consulted by and done in collaboration with indigenous people to include their influences in prescribed fire regimes. Thanks. That concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Wow, thank you, Greg. Trying to get my video started here.
Would you like me to stop sharing?
Let's do that. Let's stop sharing. Oh. Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. We see lots of little boxes now. That was a very in-depth, very detailed summary. I'm just trying to wrap my mind around it. Thanks so much, Greg. I'm sure just looking at the list of the people in our Zoom room here, I know that there's going to be people who have questions. So I just want to direct folks to place your question in the chat. What we'll do is I'll relay them to Greg and we'll do our best to get through them. As you are thinking about your question, oh, we've got one. I was going to add one of my own, but I'm going to jump into Mandy's question here and we'll go from there. Okay. So Mandy asks, are you mentioning emphasizing regeneration of Western larch? Can you remind me where larch fit within the drought tolerant, with the drought tolerance of each species? I think that is. Are larch very drought tolerant?
Of the three species, larch would be the least drought tolerant. But if you saw in the future climate projections, what are the upper elevations of the current IDF BEC zone are projected to turn into ICH essentially. So they'll become warmer and wetter. And these are the areas I would suggest focusing efforts on restoring or enhancing conditions for larch.
Okay. Okay, great, thanks. I'll just jump over to the chat here. We've got a complex system that is potentially breaking down right now. Okay, so this question comes from Trevor. Does Amarilla affect larch and ponderosa pine? And if so, does the very high incidence of Amarilla in managed Douglas fir stands affect larch and pine persistence relative to Douglas fir persistence?
Oh, armillaria, I think is the word there. Definitely not an expert in pathogens. So I might have to pass this one off. I don't know if Randy Harris is here, maybe he can speak to that.
Randy was here and not, and here and not. I wonder if he was experiencing some connection issues, perhaps.
Yeah, it works directly with these ecosystems. So
Right. Yeah. What I will just add right now is that if anybody is feeling that it's challenging to put your question in chat and you just want to ask it orally, raise your hand, and I'll call on you and you can unmute yourself and ask it. We can do that as well. Okay. So we have another question here from Marc Andre, and he says, you briefly spoke about living stumps. Could you elaborate on what that means? Thank you.
Oh yeah, for sure. So living stumps basically occur when, prior to being cut, at least one other tree was root grafted to that tree that got cut. And the root grafts occur when trees are in fairly close proximity to each other. And through pressure, the roots are forced into direct contact with each other. And as they grow through time, they kind of abrade each other and then ultimately connect. So this allows trees to physically share water and other nutrients with each other. And what happens when one of the trees gets cut is, because those roots are still grafted together, the stump is still getting nutrients from the remaining live tree. So that tree treats the stump as an injury and tries to heal it over.
Okay, I see. Wow. Okay, thanks. So our next question comes from Jessica, and she says, how did you get your historical stand basal area and density values? Is there a publicly available database for this? Oh,
those are all reconstructed from tree ring samples. So every sample I took, I recorded a height at which the sample was taken. And then I have essentially, I actually cored two. For every tree, I had 2 cores when I took cores on opposing sides, so I could average the diameter or the radius of the samples to come up with an average diameter for the tree. And then for cookies that I took, full cross sections, I just took 2 opposing measurements when I did my tree ring measurements, and then averaged those radii too to come up with an average diameter. And then there are allometric equations available to estimate diameter at breast height from inside bark diameter of stumps. So this is essentially what I use to estimate the diameter at breast height through time. So as you go back in time, your radius gets smaller and smaller, but you can track what the overall diameter of the tree is. And then you can estimate what the diameter at breast height is using those equations. And I did, for every tree, those relationships were calibrated using the 2013 measurements that I actually took of diameter at breast height. So every tree has a very specific recalibration of those allometric equations applied. So it's not just a general application of the equation. Every tree has a custom fitting of it to it.
Wow. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, so next up, Jennifer asks, with regards to the future, are you saying if nothing is done, we're heading towards a grassland? Example, no forest.
I would say if conditions persist and everything burns, probably. I mean, the way climate's looking, it's getting hotter and drier. And when these fires happen, given the structural arrangement of fuels in these forests, we're likely to just see entire swaths of forest just annihilated. And the patches will be so big that seeding in from the edges will take decades to reach the middle, maybe even centuries. I don't know. Growth rates out there aren't very high, and the drier it gets, the slower the trees will grow. So though if we leave them as is and they don't burn, I think we're just likely to see more of that self-thinning happening until there's been enough trees died that growing space is sufficient for trees to additionally or add more establishment in there. I don't know how to explain that more concisely.
I understood. Yeah. Okay, thanks. On that high note, we'll move on to the next question. So Corey asks, how are modern silviculture and provincial policies for replanting affecting the current stand composition?
Oh,
Are we
gosh.
balancing economic value with ecological value?
No, absolutely not. I've talked to several carbon modelers in particular about this very thing, and they will only consider Douglas fir. So Douglas fir is, they're happy the forests are like this because they've reached maximum carrying capacity of each site. So there's maximum basal area you can put there right now. And it's Douglas fir, which is economically valuable versus ponderosa pine or western larch. So I don't know, like I talked to Randy Harris and he said there's appetite, particularly among the larger leaseholders in these forests to potentially plant some ponderosa pine, but definitely not western larch. So I mean, my understanding is that it's going to be Douglas fir focus for the future.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Greg.
Yeah.
Okay, so another good question here from Mira. So areas of the Southern Rocky Mountain Trench are dominant in invasive plants such as downy brome, sulfur cinquefoil, St. John's wort, yellow hawkweed. Applying fire can exacerbate the invasive plant issue in forests. In your recommendations, are impacts to the orb and shrub plant community and invasive plants being considered?
Yes, that is a good one. I don't know, maybe I can flip the question here a bit. So we're currently losing open forests or grasslands at a rate of 1% per year in the trench, and open and moderately closed forests at a rate of 3% per year. So you're likely to see an entire absence of grasslands in the near future unless we start opening up these stands. Burning then does open up the opportunity for some of these invasives to establish. I think we're almost at a point now where you're unlikely to avoid having invasives in the future. And the risks of not having fire are greater than the risks of leaving things as they are. So, I mean, I think what I'm saying here is that we need to have a compromise and a tolerance for some percentage of invasives in the landscape, and hope that once we establish fire regimes, that the native plants will end up benefiting from those fire regimes that they were historically adapted to, and outcompeting these invasives they're really kind of taking advantage of these sick ecosystems at this point. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks for answering that. So next we're moving on to Garth's question. He says mortality of Doug fir is almost as high as larch and yellow pine. How come Doug fir became so dominant in the current forest? Did climate drive this?
Okay, mortality of Douglas fir.
Greg, maybe I can say historic mortality. The historic mortalities that you showed in some of your slides were almost as high for Douglas fir. And yet we end up with this very strong Doug fir component 50, 80 years later. Is there a reason why? Because you can't, Douglas fir was also reduced a lot by the looks of your data, is what I'm saying, during the historical period of high grade logging and lack of fires. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think, so what you're saying is harvesting removed almost as much of the basal area of Douglas fir. There was more Douglas fir in the past, but almost removed as much basal area. I think what's missing in that reconstruction was all the regeneration that was down in the understory that wasn't in those numbers. Most of that was Douglas fir. And that's what's come up. And had fires continued happening, a lot of that Douglas fir would have been thinned out. So with larch and ponderosa pine being more fire tolerant, especially when they're younger, because they have thicker bark than Douglas fir, you would have seen a lot of that young Douglas fir getting thinned out by subsequent fires. So without the fires, we now see them still reaching a level of dominance that hasn't existed in the past. I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. Thank you. I was looking for a mechanism and it was
Yeah.
there. Couldn't see it in your slides.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. And Garth, thanks for unmuting and clarifying. That was helpful. Okay, we have another question here from Michael. What about areas already harvested? Trees are often planted largely as monocultures with future harvest in mind and rarely left beyond 80 years.
Yeah, this kind of relates to that previous question. So they're monocultures because that's what's economically viable. That's what the forest industry wants because that's what they make their money with. Carbon modelers love Doug fir because of it's easy. It's tolerant of a lot of things, I would say. So it can persist in areas where maybe some other species can't. The wood is great. Yeah. I don't know, can we change planting requirements, provincial requirements for planting? Probably. I know like some of my research has already had an effect on ungulate winter range criteria. So there's hope.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, great. I feel just a plug for some of the talks coming up in the series that we'll be able to dive into a number of these questions in greater detail as the series moves on. So yeah, Greg, thanks so much for starting to answer some of these questions for us. Sounds like I'm wrapping up. I'm not. There's another question here. So there's a question from Denise, really interesting. How best to return to a more traditional fire regime for open forests? We cannot afford the carbon emissions from fires. Do we cut the trees and mulch in situ?
Oh my goodness. Carbon emissions in open forests are primarily coming from understory. Some of those gases, as I understand, are permanently released and can't be recuperated when the plants regrow. So understory plants in these open forests are adapted to these frequent low severity surface fires. So when they do occur, the plants can recover. So a lot of that carbon is essentially at a neutral status before and after a fire. Some of those pollutants do get released and you can't offset those. But I think what we're facing here is the way these forests are now, we're losing the entire forest in a fire versus, understory plants that can recover, and then maybe some of the overstory trees, which will ultimately be replaced by future seed crops. So I really don't see that we're having a huge carbon effect with our prescribed burning in open forests.
Okay, thanks, Greg. So I just want to take note of the time. It's 1:06. We did say that we were going to end off at 1 o'clock. But if there are any last questions, we could potentially take them right now. What's this one? There's also lobbying work to be done. Okay, there's a comment in the chat, not a question there. So I think I had a couple questions of my own, but I'm going to hold them for the sake of staying on time. If you have any questions or you want to have a follow-up discussion with Greg, I know that he's really more than willing to engage with you and answer further questions. You can connect with me for his email address if you don't have it already. You will have been able to get in touch with me via the CMI website when you registered. So there's an easy access point for you right there. So Greg, maybe at this point in time, what I'll do is I'll just thank you so much for sharing your work. This is the point at which you might want to look at your chat and see all the positive comments that we thought might be there. yeah, I know it's very complex. It's not very easy to explain it, not knowing exactly who your audience is. You've done wonderfully. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to share a slide here, but do you have any final comments while I share that slide?
Oh, I just want to say thank you, Haley, Juliet, and Kendall for putting on this awesome webinar series, and I'm happy to have been a part of it. And I, as Haley pointed out, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. I'll answer them through email.
Yeah, and if we have time, we could even stay on for a couple minutes after, and then we'll close it down, and email will be great, a great avenue. Okay, so at this point in time, I'd like to wrap up by thanking our partners and our sponsors on this event. So gratitude to the Columbia Basin Trust, gratitude from me to the Kootenai Conservation Program for this partnership, and KCP's core funders that make all of their very important work possible. And of course, we want to encourage you to come to the next talks. There are a number of them in this series that I think are going to be just fantastic. In a couple of weeks from now, we'll be welcoming Eric Higgs and Janine Ramtula. So Eric's is with the Environmental Studies Department at University of Victoria, and Janine is with the Department of Forest and Conservation Sciences with the University of British Columbia. And they have a recent collaboration that they'll be sharing, and they'll be talking about emerging landscapes novelty. So as this series progresses, we're starting pretty big picture. We're starting fairly academic, as you saw, and then as things progress, we're getting into more sort of hands-on, on-the-ground stewardship activities and that sort of thing. But of course, all of these things connect in really interesting ways. Let me just see. I think that's it from me. Anything else from KCP?
No, just a final thank you to you, Greg, for being such a fantastic speaker and sharing all this information. It was fantastic. And we're so happy to partner with you and CMI, Haley. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks very much.